VAJPEYI welcomes you all at Art Dialogues. Raza Foundation is a charitable trust founded and funded by Syed Haider Raza, a great modern Indian painter. The trust is devoted to promoting and disseminating visual arts, music, poetry, theatre, dance and ideas. It publishes three journals, two in Hindi, Samas and Swaramudra, and one in English, Arup. It organizes in IIC a series of panel discussions and conversations on culture, visual arts, music, dance, etc., 10 in a year, called Art Matters. In India Habitat Center, 8 memorial lectures for Habib Tanvi, the great theatre director, Kumar Gandharv, the musician, V.S. Gaitonde, the painter, Mani Kaul, the great filmmaker, a gay writer, Daya Krishnan, the great philosopher, Kelu Charan Mahapatra, OTC dancer, and Charles Correa, the architect. It also organizes multidisciplinary camps of Raza awardees. It has established Raza Chair in Institute of Advanced Studies, Nantes, France. It is also going to organize Raza Biennale of Indian Poetry from 7th to 9th April this month, in which poets from 45 poets from 15 languages would participate. It provides financial grants to individuals and institutions for specific projects. The grantees are in Kochi, Bangalore, Pune, Trivandrum, Asansol, Ujjain, Raipur, Delhi. It has organized series of Raza dialogues on art, culture, ideas, etc. in Kolkata, Goa, Patna, Bhopal, Pune, etc. Soon, these dialogues will also be organized in Allahabad, Imphal, Mumbai, Chandigarh, etc. It maintains a large archive of Raza Sahab. Today, we are going to have a panel discussion on Gandhi in our times. I'll invite our panelists, ASHIS Nandy, SURESH Sharma, and Ramin Jahan Belu to the stage. Kindly do come here. Panelists, they're all very well-known thinkers and sociologists and historians. ASHIS Nandy was trained as a psychoanalyst and has written on almost all important dimensions of the national life. He has written on nationalism, he has written on secularism, he has written on violence, his most important book, to my mind, is The Intimate Enemy, where he writes about the colonial experience. SURESH Sharma is a historian and anthropologist. He has thought very deeply on the idea of paganism in the world, about word and image, and has translated, that's very important, that he has translated Hindu Swaraj from Gujarati into Hindi and English with Trideep Suhrud. And Ramin Jahan Beglu is an Iranian scholar who writes in French, Persian and English, and has done interviews with and books of interviews with great thinkers like ASHIS Nandy, Isaiah Berlin, etc. He's here, and all these three panelists have some link with CSDS, Center for Studies in Developing Societies. Ashish Da and SURESH Sharma were former directors of that institute, and Ramin was a Tagore Fellow at the institute, at the center. Just to introduce the subject of the discussion today, Gandhi in our times, I'm reminded of my very brief conversation on Gandhi with a poet friend of mine in Paris. He's a poet and a philosopher. He's called Michel Duguy. I'm sure some of you might be knowing him. And we were talking about, as usual, about the world situation, etc. And he suddenly said, that you got somebody like Gandhi in your country, but you missed the train. We never ever had Gandhi in our tradition, in our culture. And you got one, such a great man, such a great insightful, such a great visionary. But But you missed him. You couldn't follow, you couldn't understand him even deeply. If you read his great book, Hindu Swaraj, and I read it in Suresh translation, he identifies India as a superior civilization. As in his words in Gujarati, he calls it Sudhar. And for Western civilization, he calls it Udhar. And I think he is one of the first thinkers of Asia who objectified Europe, who made Europe the object of this study by an Asian. And when he used the word civilization, he was not using it in relation to either Hindu or Muslim or Christian or whatever. He found in this word civilization, there's something deeper than all the religions, which all Indian religions to some extent reflect. And I think that is something most wonderful about Gandhi, that he found like, a deeper level where all Indians seem connected. And that is the word, that civilization, the Sudhar word that he uses. I think it's very similar to what in Bhaktikal they said that the children of the God. So when you say children of the God, then all religion, etc., you find a common denominator for people from all belief systems. Gandhi's relation to the idea of nationalism is also something which Suresh and Ashish both have written on and thought about a lot. It is love for the nation. It was Rashtra Prem more than the Rashtravad. Because for Gandhi, the dharmo ka dharma, the underlying principle of all the dharmas, which is the source of the value, is always above than the nation. Whereas for the nationalists of the other kind, the nation becomes the arbiter of all the values. And that's a contention of the debate between two groups. And last thing that I just want to provoke our very learned speakers, that I think Gandhi was one of the non-ideological persons, and he actually was experiencing something and then allowing his mind to wander and create ideas. In true sense of the word, he was a vicharak. The vichar word has come from char. Char means to move. And vi is a special movement, the movement of the mind. And the ideologies don't allow that to happen because they fix the movement. I think Gandhi was one of the great thinkers in that sense because he was not bound by any ideology in that sense. He could experience reality and could come up with some ideas afresh. And that's why Gandhi's writing always remain very, very fresh. I first invite Ashish Da to present his views. I'll come here.
Dealing with illusions. The presence of this small gathering itself is a good comment on how much interest there is in Gandhi. But I would also like to remind you that Gandhi arrives, or rather gate crashes into our gatherings, like Hong Kong flu, once in a few years or once in a generation. Last time he gate crashed into our lives was in 1975, between 1975 and 1977, when many of the persons who looking for inspirations outside standardized ideologies, when the left even accepted the emergency as a necessary evil, at first at least, were looking for new theoretical grounds and found Gandhism as something to offer to them. That epidemic lasted for our one generation. It began to weaken from mid-80s, and by mid-90s it was more or less dead. It is not an accident 20 years, when another generation has passed, we find again a burgeoning interest in Gandhi. And I am sure in the heart of hearts, all of you know why that is so. But as it was the case last time too, this time I am afraid also, we will try to ignore that fact and try to live with the mirage, if you like, of Gandhi as the patron saint of the Indian Republic, whereas he is only a stepfather of the nation at the moment. I always remember so. The real father of the nation, now it is emerging, is Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, whom you can consider an antipode of Gandhi, person who stood firmly against Gandhi. He was much more scholarly than Gandhi, much more modern than Gandhi, and much more in touch with world politics than Gandhi. But he never had the support he expected to have from his clientele, his constituency, and which he thought was the Hindus, because they had to constitute a nation, but they rejected him. And that rejection truly galled him. He had 3 arguments against Gandhi, and all 3, I personally believe, were not faulty within the dominant canons of our lives, including our lives, including those who work on Gandhi. First, he thought Gandhi was superstitious and anti-scientific. That's one thing. Savarkar, by the way, was a committed nationalist, and a committed rational being. And he didn't believe, he was an atheist. He didn't believe even in Hinduism, and made it very clear that his Hindutva was not Hinduism. It was something else. It was the marker of a Hindu nationality, because all European countries had nationality. To run a nation state, you need a nationality, and therefore you have to depend on Hindus to provide you or supply you with that nationality in this subcontinent. That was his position. The second point against Gandhi he had was this, that he has bought, Savarkar's argument against Gandhi was that he had brought into politics things which are totally apolitical, which have nothing to do with politics, which are absolutely bogus ideologies, like fasting, like non-violence, and so on and so forth. And the third argument against Gandhi he had was that the accusation was correct, that he was not at all acquainted with modern European political theory. These were his 3 main arguments, and it is true. So I don't want to keep you in an illusion. All around we see that there is a discomfort with Gandhi, and this discomfort was very widespread. The judge Justice Khosla, he says in his memoirs that when he passed the death sentence and allowed Nathuram Vinayak Godse to have his say in the court, he could sense that not one person in the court considered himself culpable. And if there was a referendum on that, each one present there would have voted for his acquittal. But I am not going into those details. I am trying to tell you that there can be no denial that Gandhi stood against our concept of what is common sense in politics, what are the dominant values of the Republic, and what our Constitution specifies should be the cardinal guiding principles of the Republic. It is not that he was very hostile to them, but he considered them a much smaller part of the picture. This is because there is a fundamental disjunction between Gandhi and even his own followers apart from his opponents. It was this, that since the middle of the 19th century, there has been a trend. That is why Savarkar considered Gandhi illiterate, one who didn't know the modern political theory. It is this, that since the middle of the 19th century, there has been a trend to believe that you can build human institutions so perfect that it obviates your necessity to have a moral framework yourself, or ethical framework yourself. I want to spell this out. I'm not telling you anything bully. Institutional checks and corrections, institutional reward punishment systems automatically made it impossible for people after a point, if they are well run and if you have taken good care to ensure they are reached to the most unreachable corners of India, then that would by itself produce a new kinds of India, where whether a person is by inclination a thief or a corrupt person or a killer, or it will not matter, because institutional checks will produce new kinds of citizens who will be perfect citizens. This was the assumption in every political theory produced in the second half of the 19th century, from the extreme left to the extreme right. Whereas Gandhi believed that you also needed, along with institutional changes is very important, but institutional changes you needed to inspire the people towards a new way of looking at life and a new set of ethical choices, and the individuals shared the responsibility with institutions on making the society a human society, a compassionate society, an empathetic society. This was the difference. And this distinction persists. And at the moment, we are falling back on institutional reforms all the way through. There is no doubt about it. Let me tell you a story in this connection. One of my colleagues once went to Calcutta. I want to make this very clear, what I want to say. How much time do you give me? Okay. He went to Calcutta and met these two Gujarati brothers, both business persons, who had endowed a Gujarati school for Gujarati children in Calcutta. Calcutta is the last settlement of Gujaratis, mostly in business. And this school is very important. My friend went to visit that, and they very happily took him to show the school. So when my friend went there, he found a plaque saying that this school was inaugurated by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru in 1935, when it was opened in 1930s. So he was surprised. He was a political historian. He said, this is a Gujarati school endowed by two Gujaratis for Gujarati children. And in 1930s, Gandhi used to come to Calcutta virtually every month, because his work took him to Calcutta. So why is it that you invited Jawaharlal Nehru to inaugurate the school and did not request Gandhi to inaugurate it? So the younger brother said, actually I had suggested that let us call Gandhi to inaugurate the school. But my elder brother said, please don't do that. Jawaharlal Nehru also comes to Calcutta frequently. Let him inaugurate the school, because he will come, look around the school, will be happy with that, and give us a good lecture and forget us and allow us to do our work. But if you invite Gandhi, he will come and inaugurate the school, but every other month you will receive a postcard. Are you giving milk to the children? Are you teaching them to clean the toilets? And so on and so forth. They will make your life miserable. He will make your life miserable. Now, I think it gives a flavor of the man that something of that individual idea of individual responsibility was very central to his ideology. In fact, I have sometimes the feeling, I have worked on his assassination at great length, I have sometimes a feeling of sympathy with Nathuram Vinayak Godse, because I think, if you ask me, that there was a secret bond between Gandhi and Nathuram Godse. Gandhi didn't know Nathuram Godse existed, but there was a secret bond nonetheless, of the kind you see in many Puranic episodes. I can give parallels of different kinds. And in some sense, Gandhi's assassination was almost like a play written by Gandhi but enacted by Nathuram Godse and Savarkar. And my feeling is this, that this play which Gandhi had designed for himself, because he has said more or less how he will like to die, and he died exactly the way he had suggested that he would die, or want to die. And the scenario was all spelled out in his conversations in the last few weeks of his life also. He knew he was totally defeated already. His closest associates were finding him an uncomfortable presence, because the new constitution of India was being written, a new India was emerging, and he guessed that in this India, his vision of India will have no space, or very little space. These associates were finding his presence a bit of I should say, intrusion into proper, rational, modern statecraft. He looked to them like an old man, tired and powerless. And Gandhi sensed that if he could execute his assassination and get it executed properly, perhaps his vision will survive in different guises and will often, like a bad dream or an ancestral ghost, haunt Indian Republic and provoke the citizens to think of other ways of looking at the Republic, other ways of looking at political culture, other ways of designing the future of India. And that is probably what happened. Indeed, I sometimes think that three particular components of Gandhi has become very crucial in the times we live in. If you look at the history of the last, I would say, 75 years, you will find the nature of the world's heroes have been changing. Of all the people in the world, after Gandhi, the most frequently mentioned names happen to be one who openly espoused Gandhism. Now his name has come back to American politics in a way it had never been there for a long time. Martin Luther King, the Dalai Lama, who only 40 years ago, I am old enough to remember those days when people would ask me, who is Dalai Lama and where is Tibet? Is it the place shown in Lost Horizon? The movie, the Lost Horizon invoked some kind of a Tibetan connection to many people in the West, and that was the connection of Tibet. They didn't even know. Now everybody knows about it. Aung San Suu Kyi, though her image has darkened a little after the Rohingya episodes in Myanmar, and Nelson Mandela, who had not read Gandhi,
till he went to jail in his middle age. And people began to call him Gandhian much before he himself began to call himself Gandhi. He did say ultimately that you had sent us a lawyer, we sent back you a cent. I mention this because somewhere there is an awareness today that the Gandhian vision was not all 19th century romanticism, an attempt to go back to the past, an attempt to shut the door to progress, but supplying you with a critical vision of all man-made institutions, including modernity, including the idea of progress, including the idea of development which is borrowed from an evolutionary perspective. Anything human has the potentiality of being misused. There is no concept that can never be misused in human affairs, however emancipatory or liberating they might seem at the beginning. All great autocracies have been run in the name of socialism, from Nazi socialism, national socialism of the Nazis, to Soviet communism and Chinese version of Maoism. There is no liberating potentiality of that kind, and ideologies themselves are a prime suspect in the world in which we live, because all ideologies ultimately can kill us. Including the ideology of nationalism. In the 90-volume works of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, the index lists only 13 references to nationalism. Here is the father of the nation and the leader of the nationalist movement against the Imperial Britain, and his 90-volume work, the nationalism comes in only 13 times. I don't think it's a good indexing. There are more times they are mentioned, but it is not a dominant presence there. The reason for that is this, that he presumed all Indians to be patriotic. Patriotism is different from nationalism. Nationalism is an ideology. It came to the world, that word was born in 17th century, mid-17th century. The Treaty of Westphalia, when it legitimized the nation-state system, it was then that that word became popular. Before that, we used to call it nationalism, about which Johnson had said, nationalism is the last refuge of the scoundrels, 250 years ago. So they had never, he didn't object when Tagore viciously attacked the idea of nationalism. In fact, Tagore went and gave a series of lectures on nationalism in Japan. And Japan, he was received like a hero. When he landed in Japan, tens of thousands of people came to receive him at the port. He was the first Asian to get the Nobel Prize, and he was a folk hero. When he left Japan after delivering his lectures on nationalism, only one person came to see him off, his host. Only one person. So, that hostility to nationalism of Tagore is scattered all over his 3 political novels. You can read them, everybody knows them. We try to forget that, but that is also a part of us. Here is our national poets writing against nationalism. Because they do presume there was this struggle between the idea of patriotism, which is almost a biological instinct. Because cats and dogs also are territorial. It comes from the concept of territoriality. And nationalism, which is an ideology, unlike patriotism, which is a sentiment. In nationalism, you specify enemies, specify allies, you give a more specific choices to the people, and everybody's nationalism cannot be given the full liberties which even if they are nationalist. I often mention the Pew Global Survey, which about 10 years ago showed that India was by far the most nationalist country in the world. It's a global survey. Second was Bangladesh, much below India. It's a poor second. But people are not happy with that Indians are the most nationalist in the world. There's constant extortion always, from prize distribution ceremonies in the schools to toffee distribution ceremonies and annual awards giving ceremonies and so on and so forth. Everybody is exhorting us to be more nationalist. But if you look at the data of the 20th century, the world best knows, the only century where full data on genocides is available, you will find the majority of the people were victims, majority of the victims of genocide were also victims of nationalism. That's a different story. I don't want to go into that. The point I am trying to make is this, basically, that a critical stance to the ruling, dominant dogmas of our time, the so-called sacrosanct concepts, which are seen almost as revealed, God-given, and outside the reach of human beings to correct, is a bogus attempt. It's an attempt to silence people, silence discussions and debates. Nobody mentions that there is no record of anybody in the 250-year-old history, 350 years I should say, of history of nation states, who has been associated with 4 national anthems. Tagore wrote the national anthem, Jana Gana Mana. He set music to Bankim's Vande Mataram, and sang it at the Congress conference. So that's our national song. He wrote and scored the music of Bangladesh national anthem posthumously. And despite a strand of fundamentalism in Bangladesh, at least no Bangladeshi, even fundamentalist, has suggested that the national anthem be changed. The Pakistan national anthem was originally written by a Hindu, Azad, on Jinnah's invitation. It was changed later on, after Jinnah died. But in Bangladesh, that has not taken place. He did not write the national anthem of Sri Lanka, but scored the national anthem of Sri Lanka. So there is something which deserves to go into the Guinness Book of Records. But it hasn't. It is because in the vision of the great visionaries of India, Gandhi foremost amongst them, Indian nationalism is a misnomer. Indian love for India includes the love for those outside India, and especially those who are a part of Indic civilization, who, because the vagaries of global politics, are outside India. And this means a very large territory from South Vietnam all the way to the borders of Iran. And that we have a right, every Indian citizen has the right to examine and re-examine the vision of good societies projected to us. It is not given that Indians are not what Europeans were yesterday, and who through proper development will become like what Europeans are today. That may be the vision of our elite, but that cannot be the vision of a civilization as old as the Indic civilization, because we do owe it to ourselves to redesign our future every generation. And every generation has a right to re-examine the concepts of democracy, concept of development, progress, and reconfigure them in a way more suitable for us to make it a truly autonomous, self-reflective society, and society which will not be short on human compassion and empathy. Thank you very much for your patience.
And the second debate between Tagore and Gandhi and the shadow of Sharma. Before I do that, I just want to put something to what Ashita said about nation and nationalism. I agree with almost everything he said, but his statement leaves out, I think, a very crucial and important dimension which concerns the founding moment of nationalism in Europe with Westphalia, and not only the founding moment, but its enduring and somewhat definitive presence in the making of the modern world. So much so that today you have two words to indicate the within and without of political forms. And the within is nation and nationalism, and beyond that is international. There is what it leaves out is this. This was a problem, of course, very acute and specific to Europe and Christendom because of the ideological project of the making of Christendom. The relationship between territorial space and its inhabitants had been completely ruptured. And what Westphalia instituted was that all inhabitants of a shared space share a political order and share political aspiration. And this had very profound consequences, and it continues to. And this is something... Okay. Hello? This is something which Gandhi takes up very pointedly in the debate between Gandhi and Tagore in the shadow of Jallianwala Bagh. But let me go back to the first debate of Gandhi, between Gandhi and Savarkar in 1907. The debate took place in a place called Nizamuddin Restaurant in London. And Gandhi insisted that they would cook themselves, and while cooking themselves, he said it will be only vegetarian food. This amused Savarkar immensely, because he was convinced that the kind of battle, the tough battle that had to be fought against the British Empire required people of sterner stuff than these soft vegetarians. The debate that took place between Savarkar and Gandhi in 1907, it concerned Ram and Ravan. For Savarkar, it was about sacrifice, valor, military capacity. For Gandhi, it was the idea of suffering in service. And it was a question of bringing together ends and means. It was the insistence that violent resistance is something which unleashes within the resistor's frame a chain of violence which later becomes difficult, impossible to control or sublimate. Now, cognitive ground from which Gandhi was speaking it was beyond the ambit of modernity. That's one thing. And mind you, this is at a time when modernity is still very young and full of promise. And it was very difficult to get a hearing or even to imagine that something meaningful could be said against its ultimate outcome. For Savarkar, the idea of the nation was a requirement, a fact which the struggle for survival made imperative. That if you were to survive, then you have to have this consolidation called the nation state. And that required that you create a situation of perfect unity within and efficient war without. I mean, in his phrase, it should be law within and the sword without. Gandhi's quarrel was that this business of creating a law within and wielding the sword without efficiently can never exclude the sword from the within realm either. And that is something which needs to be addressed in the very midst of battle, as it were. Now, this creating a situation of perfect law within and efficient wielding of the sword without required, in Savarkar's vision, a thorough internalization of the skills and the outlook of modern science and modern technology. And he thought that Gandhi did not understand. He was ushering in a very obscurantist vision about India, a return to the ages when the oil lamps were the only light available, a kind of a light which is weak, flickering, and very, very confined. So, Savarkar, the great author of the idea of cultural nationalism, was convinced that in the period of battle, in the period of struggle, issues of culture, philosophy, arts are at best of marginal instrumental use and value. And therefore, they are not something which need to be paid attention to. And this was extraordinary in a man because Savarkar himself was extremely well read, both in classical Sanskrit learning as well as folk literature. I mean, he knew his Tukaram extremely well. But he thought the weakness of India, the failing of India to resist, stemmed precisely from this very excessive preoccupation with philosophy, with philosophical questions, and getting trapped in these philosophical quests. These are things which you could do once you are a master of the situation, once you have established your clear dominance and power superiority. But before that, it is something to be just put away. And therefore, when, I saw an article by one of the contemporary RSS ideologues, Rakesh Sinha, that in which he recognizes that there's a near absence of intellectual, cultural presence of the kind that he would like. It has reasons which have to do with the very lineage and the conception of that frame called cultural nationalism. So it is a nationalism in which there is very little of culture. This is, of course, not very surprising because, if you look at the great cultural revolution of Mao, during the 10 years of its unfolding, altogether, in all of China, only 100 books were published. And these 100 books cover all subjects. I mean, it's not about culture I'm talking about, all cultures. And at the end of 10 years, the Cultural Revolution produced not a single cultural artifact. There is not a single cultural event that one can cite which you can say is the contribution, the creation, the outcome of Mao's great cultural revolution. Therefore, but one more thing I wish to mark about Savarkar's nationalism project, which deserves attention. Savarkar, unlike much of Hindu Mahasabha, whose president he was, much of the voices which spoke for Hinduism, he was from at least the 1920s, he voiced a very trenchant critique of untouchability. And at that time, it was something quite unusual and very special, And not only he voiced the trenchant critique of untouchability, but he also was active in promoting interdining, for instance, in 1920s, which was a very unusual thing to do, which didn't happen. Gandhi's what is meant by saying that Gandhi spoke of our times, modernity, the principal mover and shaper of things as they are. Gandhi's quarrel with that one could mark in terms of a few propositions. One, that it marks for the first time in human history a shift in the locus of value from the human logos to things. Things become the measure of value, and things become the ultimate arbiter of what ought to be. And this is dangerous. And why is it dangerous? Because this privileging of the machine as the vital formative mediation tends to reduce that certain irreducible space of autonomy which every human individual possesses. And it is the kind of space from which stem phenomenal resources, particularly in difficult times, which resists both the subtle technologies of control and brutal forms of power. I can think of no better example than of Brodsky, and he said, when I grew up, I had only heard good and beautiful things about Lenin, and that's precisely the reason why I grew up to dislike him. I was not even clear as to what I disliked, but precisely because from every quarter, from every corner, I heard things of such great beauty and of such extraordinary achievement around the name of Lenin that I began to doubt and dislike. Now, this is something which is extremely important, and it is something which is the very basis of the possibility of what we all, in some moments at least, like to cherish, that's freedom. It is the basis of that expression called dignity. It is the basis of that expression called, just being decent, just being plain decent. And these are all expressions which can never be subsumed in any kind of an ideological frame. They are, in their very, their very constitutive form, is something which doesn't lend itself to being subsumed in any ideological frame. I'll mention two other propositions that in the debate between Gandhi and Tagore in the shadow of Jallianwala Bagh, and almost 60 more years after the uprising of 1857. But the memory is still raw in folk memory and in official imperial memory, 1919. And for the last time, the invocation in justification of brutal measures by the imperial bureaucracy is preventing the repetition of 1857. And in folk memory, it is the idea of, potency, masculinity reacquired. Now, it was a difficult time. Hundreds of people had been slaughtered in Jallianwala Bagh. And Tagore said, the idea of India is something which can never draw such rigid, inflexible boundaries as to focus so entirely and so absolutely on India, and focus in a way which induces regimentation, making everybody do the same thing, everybody shout the same slogan. This regime of repetition and regimentation is flawed and dangerous. Now, I will not go into the details of this argument itself, which are extremely important and significant, but just underscore 2-3 things. One, that even in this moment when hundreds of people had been slaughtered, unarmed people, by a squad of the British Indian Imperial Army, there was never a suggestion, please don't raise these delicate issues at this difficult moment. There was no question of accusing anyone, and least of all the poet, of treason. And in fact, Gandhi's response was magnificent. He said, it is a privilege that we have a custodian of the idea of India, its honor, who is fearless and prescient and would not rest if he sees any danger and any slight to its honor and would speak up under the most difficult conditions. And this is something we must always nurture. And Gandhi kept this. In 1942, when he moved the Quit India resolution, 13 people voted against it. They were all communist members who had joined the Congress. And since by the time the Soviet Union had become a part of the war, it had to be supported, and supported unconditionally and absolutely to the hilt. And Gandhi's response to them was, I congratulate you for your courage. I think you are profoundly in error. You are doing something unthinking and stupid, but that you have the courage of your belief, and even as you stand isolated, you oppose it. I think this is something which deserves commendation, as long as you believe in it. Of course, the communist members didn't understand what the old men were saying. They were totally uncomprehending. I mean, it made no sense to them whatsoever. So that's one very, very important thing. The other thing is that in this debate, for Tagore's quarrel was about the repetitive regimentation that a machine induces. And with this he raised a very poignant question which Gandhi did not address in this debate, although he does address it elsewhere, I believe. And the question was that in India, repetition of an enforced kind has reduced the man into becoming a machine. And that is the logic of stagnation. So the rule of the machine in India is signified by a repetition represented by man becoming machined. And in the West, it is the rule of machined inspired by the idea of a forever forward march, the grand unending road to infinity in the quest for progress, where the machine is the arbiter. And both are destructive of this irreducible autonomous space. Gandhi's, the quarrel that Gandhi principally focused on in this debate between him and Tagore was that machine is some repetition is involved, entailed in the very fact of life. And this entailment of repetition in the fact of life entails acceptance of repetition through the machine also. Gandhi's principal quarrel, as voiced in this, was that machine as an expression, an embodiment of a certain level of concentration of power, and the possibility of enhancing this concentration of power infinitely, seems to be leading to a situation where he gave the metaphor of the plough, that supposing you could have a plough which could plough all the land of the world, which could produce enough food for everyone, nobody goes hungry, the perfect plough mechanically, technologically is in place, and nobody needs to slave and labor and repeat. Would it be a good thing or would it be a bad thing? And Gandhi's answer was that it would be a very bad thing, because it would spell two things. One, dependence, and two, abolishing the prospect of work for most people. And in the absence of work, humans and human civilizations, as not just as we have known, but as we imagine it to be, would become, would disappear. Would disappear. And this, I think, is something very, very significant and important to remember. I will conclude with certain shifts, reversals, which mark our times. First, in relation to the word outside, if even 30 years ago, if ASHIS at a seminar in somewhere in Europe or America had said that ethnicity would be an issue of even significant, not deviant, but significant importance in the politics and life of Europe and America, identity politics would have been laughed out. It would seem something not thinkable. But now, in the last 10, 20 years, we have been witnessing the surfacing of identity politics, of ethnicity. And this is in a situation where the world is so much more alike than it has ever been before. People are eating the same kind of things much more than they used to. People are wearing the same kind of clothes than they used to. And people are even speaking in larger and larger number the same language, the one we are speaking in now, than they were earlier. And yet, the experience of community is something which is increasingly more and more fleeting, if there at all, from the lives of most people. And yet, in this situation, in Europe and America, the resurfacing in such a powerful way of identity politics is now a well-recognized fact. Another thing which is, I think, very striking for the first time, that the United States of America has rejected, or at least the president voted by a near majority, the idea of climate change. Now this, I think, is the first institutional instance where the United States of America has expressed lack of faith in scientific procedures of finding ascertainment. Of course, the very idea of recognizing climate change as an issue has an interesting story in a different direction, because, you know, the word ecology was not something which had any resonance before 1970s. It was not something which the greatest minds who had invested in thinking about and speaking about modernity had recognized or paid any attention to. I take a little more time. Yeah, okay. Then the other thing I want to mark is that China and the New World Order, and China is having an increasingly more definitive say in the making of this New World Order. And China represents something quite exceptional in this context. Not only is it outside Europe, but it is a country with a very ancient civilization. But this civilization, I think, has been reformed, you know, not reformed, but reformed by the Marxist, communist, Maoist intervention. And my main quarrel is that there is no proposition of a universal kind that the Chinese enterprise, the Chinese involvement in the making of the new order, which stands at a clear distance from power, which stands at a clear distance from constituted forms of power and authority. The only proposition, the only principle they put in the center of their discourse and debate is efficiency. Beyond that, there is nothing, there is no ground from which anyone, no matter how marginal, how dispossessed, can speak and engage in a conversation and an argument with the claims of the kind of reordering that China seeks to do. And this is something very, very important. Now, the shifts and reversals within India, I want to just mark very quickly. In 1947, we accepted the creation of Pakistan, but under Gandhi's inspiration, and we rejected the principle of religion or faith as the basis of nationhood. And now and that was a grand choice. And it was a very lonely choice, because nobody firstly took you very seriously on that. Nobody wanted to give you a good certificate. This is a great thing you're doing. Just as in the 1950s and 60s and even 1970s, democracy was something which was not really seen as a thing fit for this part of the world. The great exemplars of good governance were Field Marshal Ayub Khan, Shah of Iran in this part of the world. And these exemplars of good governance were endorsed very, very strongly by the Western state systems and the intellectual discourse in the various university disciplines. I think there have been two great failings which have troubled us, continue to trouble us. One is what is spoken of as the communal failing, and the other failing is the dynastic failing. And both have roots which go in different directions. But in the modern contemporary context, I want to say that the dynastic failing is something which has been not sufficiently attended to. It is not something which has troubled the liberal left intellectual discourse. There has been extraordinary indulgence. So the kind of indulgent view people are willing to take of 1984 is something really extraordinary. This is something which is, I think, very, very serious. You know. And the other is that the unwillingness to stand up for dissent within the Islamic world. And this despite, you know, there are, as one looks around, I see such voices of such great courage in Pakistan, few, lonely, but willing to speak, daring to speak. And not just that, this I just cited, it's so near to home. Now the last shift I want to conclude with is in the current practice of Savarkar's Hindutva. Savarkar clearly recognized two things, even as he formulated, propagated, and vehemently affirmed Hindutva, that Hindutva and Hinduism are two very different things. They are not the same thing at all. Not that he disliked or despised Hinduism, but he thought it created vulnerabilities which needed to be surgically addressed. And this surgical address is what Hindutva sought to accomplish. But he was absolutely clear that these are two different forms of life, you know, Hindutva and Hinduism. Two, Hindu Rashtra and Indian nationalism are two very different and distinct entities. Not only that, you know, I think Savarkar as an intellectual is severely underestimated. And I say this as a critique of Savarkar. He was explicit that Indian nationalism represents a higher level, a more elevated level of social political fact and aspiration. But the current historical situation doesn't allow us the privilege of that indulgence, and therefore we cannot have it. It has to be ruled out. the recent shift, very vigorously pursued, is the collapsing of the idea of Hindutva and Hinduism. The collapsing of the idea of Hindu Rashtra and Hindu nationalism. And the terrain which is sought to be created to feed this collapse, I may also mark, collapsing popular culture with folk culture. I will just conclude with two lines from Gandhi. And these are lines about where Gandhi's addressing what is dirt. And Gandhi says, matter misplaced is dirt, and reason misplaced is lunacy. Thank you.
Thanks.
But before that, I would like to thank Ashok VAJPEYI, and I would like to thank UDYAN to have invited me to be with ASHIS and SURESH. Actually, what I like to say is I've been working on Gandhi for the past 30 years of my life, and now that I'm back in India, I have more the reason to work on it, because now I'm the executive director of the Mahatma Gandhi Center at General University. So more the reason to be active on Gandhi. And the aspect which has always interested me is not relationship of Gandhi to India only, but the impact of Gandhi outside India, in different continents and around the world, and of course on the movements and influences which have been there for the past 70 years, I would say, in different places. So, like all of you, actually, I often wonder why is it that the passage of time, and especially 70 years after the independence of India and Gandhi's assassination, Gandhi is still very relevant, and we go on talking about Gandhi, even though if we don't talk much about Gandhi inside India, outside India, whenever there is a social movement, political movement, like the Arab Spring, Iranian Greve movement, and previously Martin Luther King Jr., Aung San Suu Kyi, Mandela, as Ashish actually talked about, name of Gandhi comes back, and Gandhian nonviolence has always been there. So the question I've been asking myself is, why do we feel that Gandhi's place in history is always in the future and not in the past? When we talk about Gandhi, we're not, at least this what I've been doing in my own work, like in the books I've written on Gandhi in French, Persian, and English, and I continue writing, I always put Gandhi in front of me and not in the past, in my back. And the answer is obvious, because I think that Gandhi is maybe the only political theorist who has been dealing with universal values of peace and nonviolence. And today, in today's world, actually, we need them more than ever. Though I agree with Ashish that Gandhi from time to time has been marginalized. But when I see, I mean, in an age of what I would call Trumpian politics, or Trumpization of politics, I called it Trumpization of politics, the rise of populism in Europe, people like Duterte and Erdogan around the globe, I think that Gandhi becomes an antidote to populism. It becomes an antidote again to tyrannies, an antidote to dictatorships, and certainly, even though there is a great deal of superficiality and shallowness, even in the academic, I would say, world, and mainstream politics in our world, to talk about in the way we talk about peace, in the way we talk about violence and nonviolence, I think that, again, the key issues, if we want to discuss the key issues, we have to go back and read Gandhi, not as a political leader, but as a political theorist, mostly. And I think that's the important part that we have to do. So I think that Gandhi provides us with an intellectual substance to our understanding of peace and nonviolence. And when we look forward, I cannot imagine any other way to engage many of us in thinking and in practicing modes of peace building. And this is right now what I'm doing. I'm doing it with Pakistanis, Nepalis in India, and I'm going to Colombia and Latin America in May to have it, because they won the Peace Award, to have it with corporate leaders, government leaders, and with students. And I started a movement which is called Students for Peace. And I started this movement in India. And I'm taking this movement outside India to make it global as much as we can. Why? Because I think that it would be not exact to talk about Gandhi only as a political leader of the independence of India, but Gandhi as a theorist of revolution of values. What has been very important, I think, in the Gandhian mainstream, and we see it with MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., especially at the end of his life in 1967, is what we call the revolution of values. This is what our world needs more than ever, is not a political revolution, but a revolution of values. And I think that Gandhi was certainly is the initiator and animator of this revolution of values. Now, for many reasons, I would try to be very brief. Firstly, because he had a multi-centered and multi-dimensional view of politics as the art of organizing the society. You know, we are very wrong always to talk about politics as party politics. And Gandhi never wanted to talk about politics as party politics. Politics is the art of organizing the society. Either you have the art of it or you don't have the art of it. It's not about corruption, as we have it in India. It's not about power sharing, as we have it in India and elsewhere. It's not about imposing and dominating others. It's about organizing the society. It's having the talent of organizing. And this is what the Greeks understood very well. Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, everybody. And they called it art of organizing the society. So I think that Gandhi is somebody who's very close to the Greeks, ancient Greeks, because when he talks about politics, he doesn't mean party politics. And that's why as soon as India becomes independent, he takes his distance from the Congress Party and from all party politics. Secondly, because I think Gandhi had a cosmopolitan view that seek to overcome all exclusivist modes of thinking, you know. And thirdly, because I think that he had an evolutionary vision of an inclusive democracy, which disapproved all forms of cultural, national, or religious superiority. When we're talking about inclusive democracy, we cannot have Hindutva. We cannot talk about religious fundamentalism. We cannot talk about nationalist fundamentalism. There is no such thing. We're talking about inclusive. And I think that at that level, Gandhi was also a pioneer, as somebody who was a forerunner. And here I think that what has been very dear to my work on Gandhi and my comparative analysis of Gandhi with political theorists is how you can preserve your own culture, your own identity, by in same time having a dialogue with other cultures and other identities. What we call the transvaluation of cultures, okay? Meaning you can take the best from one culture and bring it to your own culture and actually play with it, work with it, and out of it you make something new. Okay, I think that Gandhi is a theorist, is somebody who can help us understand that in many senses. And so this cultural plurality, which is so central to our world today and so anti-Trumpian, in nature and practice, I think brings out another feature of Gandhi's relevance for our times, since we're talking about the relevance for our times. Gandhi, as you know, hated the distinction between foreign and indigenous. He says it himself. Go and read Young India, October 1931. He says, I hate the distinction between foreign and indigenous. Now, in a world where one of the, today, actually, when you watch BBC World Service and France 24 and TV5 and Indian channels, one of the issues is actually the refugees in Europe and how they close down in places like Hungary and other places. They're closing down, and they make this differentiation between foreign and indigenous, okay? And this has to do with our moral conscience and how we deal with people in today's world. And it is actually the expression, the true expression of politics in our world, and decline of politics in the sense of the art of organizing a society. So not only Gandhi rejected the polarization of the society between us and them, but also because he wanted, I think, and he and others who followed him, they wanted to talk about communities which can actually be among different cultures, be among different nationalities, among different, I would say, religions. And this, I think, we can call recognition of shared values in our world, which is so important. Where are our shared values? Where are our ethical shared values in today's world on which we can build our society, our human society, and we can have our dialogue of cultures? So this is actually, Gandhi himself has been constantly experimenting with modes of cross-border cultural constellations. He was himself doing that all the time. And I believe this capacity to engage constructively with conflicting values was an essential component of practical wisdom and empathic pluralism in Gandhian nonviolence, and is still there. And it's a very dialogical mode of pluralism which brings what Aristotle used to call civic friendship in our world. Civic friendship is something which is very important, I think, to bring responsible citizenry, but also shared sovereignty. Now, in my book, Gandhian Moment, I say that Gandhi is somebody who tries to replace Hobbesian sovereignty, the idea of sovereignty in modern politics, by what I call shared sovereignty. Shared sovereignty which is inclusive, which is democratic, which is not necessarily liberal, but is democratic. And I will finish on that because I think that nowadays I have arrived at this solution, and these are the actually subjects I've been discussing in my latest books. Gadflies in the Public Space, Decline of Civilization, which is coming out in 1 month in Aleph. I think that the essence of Gandhian politics today are two words: resistance and dissent. Resistance and dissent. Anybody who wants to revision Gandhi, read Gandhi anew, if authentically reads Gandhi today, will get to these two concepts. How to resist philosophically and politically the shallowness, the meaninglessness, and the thoughtlessness of our world, and how to replace it with democratization of democracies and the transition from tyrannies to democracies, but through the idea of dissent and disobedient mind. Because I think Gandhi was one of those, like Tolstoy, like Henry David Thoreau, and after him Martin Luther King Jr. and some others, to have a disobedient mind. And there is no thinking without disobedient mind, because thinking by definition is thinking otherwise. Thinking by definition is thinking otherwise. So I think that, to end, I think that Gandhi, 7 decades after his death, he stands as one of the most significant and relevant non-Western theories of democracy in today's world. And if we want to re-theorize democracy today, we will certainly need Gandhi today. Thank you.
Already run out of the time. I'll just like to give some flowers to our panelists, and We would have loved to take some questions, but I think we are already run out of the time, so some other time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We can come back always.
Yes.
Thank you. So we can go on?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
What is it?
Thank you very much for coming here and attending it so peacefully and quietly. This next discussion will be held on 7th of next month, and you'll be told the topic of it in a week's time.